They say the dead can't speak, but if you listen closely enough, sometimes their shame still echoes. In the rusted silence of a forgotten Tennessee hollow, there once stood a house with windows nailed shut from the inside. No visitors, no mail, no footsteps, safe for those already within its walls. Inside that crooked home lived a man named Elias Redfield, a man whose blood ran in circles, a man whose family tree was less a tree and more a knot. The young woman beside him he called his wife. But everyone in town, everyone who dared whisper about that place, knew what else she was. She was also his sister. Elias wasn't born from sin. He was born into it, born from generations of breeding that turned cousin into wife and uncle into father. It hadn't started with him. His own mother and father were siblings, too. Their parents before them, cousins. All of them hidden away in that same valley, as if the hills themselves were conspiring to keep their secrets locked in. No photographs exist of Elias before 1949. But there is a drawing, charcoal on paper, yellowed with age, showing a boy with wide, wet eyes. He sits next to a girl who looks almost identical. Their hair is matted. Their hands are clasped. And the caption below reads, in a shaking script, "They only had each other." What no one could explain was how the Redfield line had managed to persist for over a century in that hollow. The nearest town, 5 miles away, claimed they thought the family was long dead. But local children told stories of how, if you walked past the old dirt path past midnight, you'd hear a lullaby. Not sung in English, not sung in any known tongue, just a humming bone deep and wrong. When county officials finally came knocking, it was because of a smell. The smell of rotting meat. No electricity. No plumbing, just a silence thick enough to suffocate. And what they found inside that house, behind the nailed windows, in the rotting cradle upstairs, would turn Elias Redfield into something worse than legend. He'd become a case no medical journal dared publish. A man whose bloodline had folded in on itself so many times it had become something else. And yet, in his own words, "I loved her like a husband. But I knew her like a brother." They called it Redfield Hollow, but no one could tell you where the name first came from. It wasn't on most maps, and if you asked around in nearby townships, you'd get the same answer again and again, a shrug, a mutter, or a quick change of subject. But the truth is, Redfield Hollow wasn't forgotten. It was deliberately erased, not by time, but by fear. You see, Redfield Hollow wasn't just where Elias lived. It was where generations of his blood had buried themselves, not 6 feet under, but into each other. Marriage records in the county archives show a strange pattern, names repeating every generation. John Redfield marries Sarah Redfield. 20 years later, their son marries another Sarah Redfield. Birth records list only 1 or 2 children each generation. Always with biblical names, always born at home. No hospital documentation, no formal education, just a spiral inward, tighter, closer. The soil there is rich with bones, but most of them were never put in caskets. A local gravedigger, long dead now, once wrote in his journal that he was paid in canned goods to cover over the little ones. When pressed, he never explained what he meant by little. But some who read that line say it didn't refer to age. It referred to form, misshapen, unfit, not right. Somewhere around 1933, a surveyor from Nashville went missing in those woods. His last known correspondence was a letter to his wife describing a quiet glen with an unnatural silence and 3 children staring from a cornfield. He was never found, but the letter was recovered. What troubled authorities most wasn't what he wrote, but what was written on the back in a childish scrawl: "Don't come here. We don't want you." Elias grew up inside that world. Born to Marianne and Luther Redfield, siblings by blood and husband and wife by arrangement. No one outside knew about the birth, and no one ever visited, not a doctor, not a midwife. Only the cries of the baby echoed through the cabin, followed by a silence that lasted years. Inbreeding wasn't a word used openly back then. But even if it had been, it wouldn't have captured what the Redfields were. This was not mere incest. This was a deliberate tradition, a belief, a ritual, one that Elias came to believe made him pure. He didn't just inherit the sickness. He embraced it. Her name was Clara. At least that's what the Bible on the mantel called her. Written in a trembling hand across a page meant for births and deaths, Clara Redfield, born of Mary Ann and Luther, May 5, 1931. No hospital, no witness, just the word of her parents and her brother. Elias was 3 years older than Clara. And from the moment she was born, she belonged to him, not as a sister, not even as a daughter, but as something else entirely. Something he'd later describe as mine before God knew her. They were never separated. They slept in the same bed well into adolescence, played only with each other, ate in silence, always with heads bowed, hands touching under the table. The Hollow had rules, unspoken, inherited. One of them was this: no outsider can take what the blood provides. That meant no schooling, no doctors, no visitors, and no other lovers. When Clara turned 12, something shifted. Elias began calling her my future, not sister, not friend. And by the time she was 15, the town clerk who handled rare supply deliveries noted something odd. Clara had stopped speaking, not a word. She only looked at Elias when spoken to, as if awaiting permission to exist. The house itself changed, too. Curtains never opened. A fresh lock added to the upstairs room. Locals delivering food would leave it at the gate and return the next morning to find it taken. No thanks, no note, just the faint smell of kerosene and iron wafting from the trees. Then one summer, Clara disappeared. People assumed she had died, but 5 years later, she reappeared on the porch with a child in her arms. No one had seen her pregnant. No one had seen her grow. She was just there, as if the woods had released her. Elias introduced her formally for the first time as his wife. It wasn't questioned, not openly, not because it made sense, but because no one dared disturb the sleeping sickness that was Redfield Hollow. There were rumors, of course, whispers about how Clara stared through people like glass, how her fingers never stopped twitching, how the child she held never once cried. A local preacher once tried to intervene. He walked up the hill to speak with Elias. He never came back. Days later, his Bible was found nailed to a tree, open to the story of Lot, and inside a single line had been underlined in blood, and he knew them. The boy had no birth certificate, no records, not even a name. According to the midwife who was bribed with moonshine and silence to keep what she saw to herself, she didn't last long after the delivery. Within a year, she had packed up her home, left town, and was later found in Memphis, mute, institutionalized, scribbling drawings of a house with no windows and a baby with 3 arms. But the child Elias and Clara raised was not deformed, at least not on the surface. He looked almost normal, until you looked too long. The locals who glimpsed him from the road said his eyes didn't match. One pale grey, the other a deep black that never blinked. He never smiled, never spoke, just clung to Clara's skirt like a ghost sewn to her shadow. When he turned 6, the family stopped appearing altogether. No food deliveries, no sounds from the Hollow. The trees grew thicker around the path, as if nature itself was trying to swallow the house whole. It wasn't until the county forced an inspection after years of unpaid taxes that the door was finally broken down. What they found was something no man could forget. The house was choked with mold, wallpaper peeled in sheets like dead skin. The air smelled of copper and rot. Clara sat in a rocking chair, still, her hair falling out in thick patches, her eyes open but unseeing, and her arms cradled a bundle of rags. She whispered too softly, over and over, "Hush now. Dad is watching." Elias stood in the kitchen holding a carving knife. He was clean-shaven, shirt buttoned to the throat, calm. He greeted the sheriff like an old friend and said, "The boy's upstairs, but he don't answer to names no more." When they entered the child's room, they found walls covered in writing, scratched into wood, not ink. No words, just symbols, spirals repeated hundreds, maybe thousands of times. And the boy was gone. The window had been smashed from the inside. A single footprint led to the sill, bare, small, and bloody. He was never found. But weeks later, a farmer 2 counties over reported something strange. His cows wouldn't go near the woods anymore. Birds stopped singing near the creek. And carved into the bark of an old sycamore was a spiral, deep, fresh, and bleeding. Elias Redfield never tried to run. When they took him in, he walked barefoot, wrists bound loosely in rope, humming something low and broken under his breath, a tune that the sheriff later described as sounding more like weeping than music. In custody, he spoke willingly, eagerly, as if he'd been waiting decades for someone to ask. What he told them didn't make sense. Not at first. He claimed the child wasn't his. Claimed it wasn't even human. It was born from the blood, but it ain't ours, he said. It chose Clarara, but it spoke through me. Deputies laughed, but the older ones, men who remembered the stories their fathers used to tell about the Redfields and their woods and the strange lights above the hollow on moonless nights, they didn't laugh. Elias said the family had a duty, a blood promise. Every third generation, one must be born unknowing, pure of record, pure of name, so that the old ones don't forget us. When asked who the old ones were, Elias just smiled. Not who. What? And they live beneath. He claimed that long ago, before settlers, before maps, the hollow had been a site of reverence for something ancient, something that wasn't God, but demanded worship just the same. And the Redfields, by blood and by vow, were its keepers. Every marriage, every child, every broken bone and buried shame, was part of a larger design to preserve the spiral, to keep the cycle from breaking. He said Clarara was chosen before she was even born. That his marriage to her wasn't desire. It was destiny. The blood remembers, he muttered. It always remembers. The court-appointed psychiatrist said Elias was suffering from generational trauma and delusion brought on by decades of isolation and incest. But there were inconsistencies, things Elias couldn't have known. Details about the surveyor who went missing in 1933, about the preacher's Bible, about symbols carved into trees miles from Redfield Hollow that Elias had never seen. When asked how he knew those things, Elias just leaned in and whispered, "Because the boy dreams them into me." It was then they realized. Elias believed the child was still connected to him, that somewhere in the woods, his son watched through his eyes, fed thoughts through his sleep. Clarara never spoke again. After the raid, she was institutionalized under a false name. Her identity buried by a county desperate to distance itself from the nightmare. Medical reports described her as catatonic, occasionally responsive to music, but entirely mute. Except she wasn't. Nurses reported strange behaviors. She would hum softly, but only when the room was completely dark. Her fingers would trace invisible circles on her bedsheets over and over again, always counterclockwise. And once, just once, she whispered something to a janitor who found her standing barefoot in the hallway, eyes wide, lips trembling. She said, "He's still in the cradle." When staff checked her room, they found nothing. But in the corner, tucked beneath the metal-framed bed, was a cloth bundle wrapped in threadbare fabric, rocking gently, though no breeze stirred. Inside it, nothing but dirt and a single spiral carved into the mattress frame beneath. They moved Clarara to high-security care after that, but she never reacted again. Not to therapy, not to visitors, not even to news of Elias's death. Elias died in his cell one autumn night. No wounds, no known cause, just slumped over, eyes wide, pupils blown out like he'd seen something final. The guards found a note pressed beneath his tongue. It was folded twice, the paper yellow with age, a Bible page, torn and underlined, "And their seed shall become a curse among the people." But the handwriting wasn't his, not exactly. It was familiar, a match for his mother's, some said, or Clarara's, or maybe even the child's, because the ink was fresh, and no one could explain how it had gotten into his mouth. After Elias's death, strange things began to happen in the woods around Redfield Hollow. Hunters stopped going there. Dogs refused to cross the stream near the property line. Trees were found bent in spirals, not cut, not broken, but twisted unnaturally, roots still intact. Locals say that sometimes late at night, you can hear it again. That lullaby, not sung, but breathed through the leaves, always from the direction of the old Redfield cabin, long since burned. Yet the wind still avoids that hill like it's holy. And in the ash, if you dig just right, you'll find what they left behind. A cradle, empty, but still rocking. The official story ends with a fire. In 1971, months after Elias's death, the Redfield home burned to the ground. Arson was suspected, but no one confessed. Some believe it was the county, a quiet erasure, an attempt to smother the shame. Others say it was the boy, finishing what his father couldn't. No remains were found, no bones, no ash of human form, just blackened timber, scorched earth, and the spiral. Always the spiral. But legends don't burn. They migrate. Reports of similar symbols began surfacing miles away, then counties over, in abandoned barns, in children's closets, carved into school desks and park benches, always crude, always fresh. No one ever saw who made them, only that they were there, waiting. One night, a family camping 2 towns east of the Hollow reported their 6-year-old son missing. He was found unharmed the next morning, curled under a tree, eyes wide, whispering a lullaby no one recognized. When asked where he'd been, he simply said, "With the boy with 2 eyes." The story was buried. Local press dismissed it. Another child's imagination, they said. But those who know, they understand. The spiral is not just a symbol. It's a path, a map of descent, a mark of contamination that moves not through cities, but through blood, through silence, through shame. Elias didn't invent it. He inherited it. And Clara, she was merely the vessel. But the boy, whatever he became, was something new. We want to believe monsters are born of violence. That broken families, twisted rituals, and generational horror are rare. That they live only in places like Redfield Hollow, forgotten, remote, safe from us. But the truth is simpler and far more terrifying. Monsters are made in silence. They're born when no one asks questions. When the bloodlines run tight and the whispers grow louder than the screams. They hide in plain sight in houses with closed curtains. In names that repeat across generations. In children told not to speak of what they've seen. Elias Redfield called her his sister wife. He believed his love was sacred, that his bloodline was chosen, and maybe in his madness he saw something we weren't meant to. Because if you follow the spiral long enough, you don't find the monster. You find yourself. And you realize the Hollow was never a place. It was a curse. One that still walks and still watches.